DevilNeverCry.
Just a few weeks on from the launch of Final Fantasy XVI, and Square Enix have finally given fans what they've wanted. Before we even begin discussing the latest patch, can you believe that Final Fantasy XVI sold more than 3 million copies in less than a week? A subject I forgot to discuss, primarily because I was preoccupied with making guides for Final Fantasy XVI, but in my own personal opinion, considering Final Fantasy XVI is only on one console, I think that's a pretty strong number. I know a lot of discussion and discourse surrounding the 3 million number is primarily around the fact that it has sold less than Final Fantasy XV, but you have to realize that that's sold on a myriad of different consoles and had years and years and years of build up to its launch ever since it was Final Fantasy Versus 13. Coincidentally, we also know that PlayStation paid a premium to ensure that it remained an exclusive, so I'd imagine Square Enix probably made out like bandits considering how well it sold. But I digress. I'm interested in hearing what you think in regards to that number, however, as I'm sure many of you probably don't agree with my own opinion. Moving on to the topic of today's video, a new patch for Final Fantasy XVI is finally here. It took just over 2 weeks from launch, and I think that's a pretty swift turnaround time, especially considering everything addressed in this patch were pretty much things that people complained about after launch and not things that they were likely perhaps aware of before it. So let's unpack what exactly is featured in this new patch. Well, first and foremost, we have new control schemes to choose from when playing the game. Final Fantasy XVI initially only launched with 3 different control types, A, B, and C. I know a lot of you have been curious as to what exactly I play with, and I play primarily with A. I have dabbled with some of the other control schemes, including Control Scheme D, E, and F, which I've introduced into this patch. But quite honestly, considering I've put close to 100 hours into this game, I'm finding it very hard to overcome that muscle memory and press different buttons to do things that I'm kind of used to them doing, if that makes sense. Whilst I'm glad that we actually have more options to choose from, a big part of me wishes that they would just let us remap the entirety of the controls so we can mold them as we see fit. I've been tempted to use control types like Control Type C or Control Type F, but unfortunately I'm just not a big fan of having icon changing mapped to the triangle button, the face button, as it just feels quite abnormal. If perhaps we were able to remap everything, and I know that you can do this on a system level, I believe from the PlayStation 5 software, but it's just not the same, and quite honestly would just be a whole lot easier if they let us do it via the game. Alongside that addition, however, patch 1.03 also features some other quality of life changes that people might enjoy. The first of which is that now you're able to bump up your camera sensitivity, both horizontally and vertically, from the initial maximum of 10 all the way up to 20. This allows for greater precision when tweaking your settings and probably alleviates a lot of the frustrations of people who felt that the camera just didn't turn quite fast enough. They've also added in a setting which allows you to toggle on or off whether or not the camera automatically follows Clive whenever he is moving or attacking. I didn't necessarily see this as that big of an issue. At first I thought it was a little bit weird, but I very quickly got accustomed to it throughout my 100 hours of playing. But again, I understand the reason why they've decided to include these toggles, as ultimately it just provides the player more control with their experience. Before we get to the largest change in this patch, which has been the hugest point of discussion, one other change that they've made is that they've apparently corrected some text issues throughout the game. Quite a vague way to phrase it, and ultimately leaves me curious as to what exactly they've changed. Part of me wonders whether or not they've tweaked the active time law system. For those of you that don't know, there have actually been reports of the active time law system spoiling key moments in the game's story before they even happen. I won't go into any specifics, as I know some people still haven't finished this game, but they do perhaps allude to who exactly the main villain is, as well as the fate of some of the dominants. Which, considering how important those things are to the overall narrative, I'm not surprised if they've gone in there and tweaked certain things. That finally brings us on to the largest change that they've introduced in this patch, and that is the option to toggle or adjust the motion blur in the game. I'm not necessarily exaggerating when I say that the motion blur was the largest point of contention and discussion surrounding Final Fantasy XVI, perhaps aside from the overall performance, and that's simply because of how aggressive the motion blur was. To the point where even some people felt physically sick playing the game due to how intense the blur was whenever you adjusted the camera, no matter how big or how small. The default setting for the motion blur, as is pre-patch, I believe is at the maximum level of 5, and you're able to toggle it back if you want to reduce it, or you can turn it off entirely by simply setting it to 0. And in all honesty, this is a key example of why constructive feedback is so important. Because so many players or fans of Final Fantasy commented on the motion blur situation, whether it's in the comments of blog posts or the replies, or even creators on YouTube or Twitch, Square Enix had no choice but to simply listen and act upon the feedback that they had received, much to the benefit of the community and Square themselves, who are being praised for listening, and fans finally get to enjoy a game without any motion blur. Examples like this of changes being made as a result of direct community feedback are exactly why I'm an advocate of posting constructive feedback and always letting companies know whether or not you like or dislike something and whether or not you want something changed. As I previously alluded to, the performance of Final Fantasy XVI, even in performance mode, is one of the other biggest gripes that people tend to have with this game. And so personally, I'm curious to see whether or not in a future patch we see that performance be addressed. That pretty much wraps it up for what's included in Final Fantasy XVI's latest patch, but it isn't the end of the video. Last week I was invited down alongside a few other creators by Square Enix to behold Clive's Invictus Sword, which was displayed in the Tower of London. It was pretty surreal to see a full-size working replica put together by an actual blacksmith, but even weirder to see it displayed in the Tower of London alongside the arms of several other historical kings from the United Kingdom's history. Sadly, no matter how much gil I threw at them, the guards at the Tower of London wouldn't actually let me hold Invictus or even take it home. Maybe I'll have to come back when everybody's sleeping. Before we finally wrap up, I do want to say a big thank you to everybody who's been supporting and watching my Final Fantasy XVI content, and I'm glad that so many of you have found the guides useful. As I've previously said, I'm always open for suggestions, so if there's a video you want to see me make in regards to Final Fantasy XVI, then let me know down in the comments below. Alongside that, let me know your general thoughts on this overall patch, and whether or not you're appreciative of the changes they've made by including this motion blur slider, or if you feel that Square Enix should be doing more with their patches. If you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to leave a like and subscribe, as there's more content on the way. And with all of that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.